Today I'm going to be walking through how to make this multi-way crop top. I've made the pattern available on my Etsy, which is linked down below, and I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible. So let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this project. I would recommend a 4-way stretch fabric. I'm using 95% cotton, 5% elastane, and I believe this was from Little Legs Fabrics. You will also need some fabric scissors, some pins. I would highly recommend a loop turner for making your straps. You will need a tape measure. This is optional, but I would recommend some fusible interfacing to hem the top. And you will also need an iron. In terms of my sewing machines, I will be using an overlocker, but if you don't have an overlocker, you can use a zigzag stitch. And then I will also just be using a regular machine as well. So the pattern that I'm going to be using for this project is my Sadie pattern. So I have one piece for the front and one piece for the back. For each of these pieces, you just want to cut out 2 pieces from your fabric. So that's going to be 4 pieces in total, and 2 of those are going to act as a lining. So if you want to, this top can actually work as a reversible top. So if you want to do the lining in a different colour so that you essentially have 2 tops at the end, you can do that as well. So I'm just going to cut 2 pieces for the front of my top and then 2 for the back. And I'm also going to draw these marks in as well, which is where I'm going to attach my straps to. I'm just going to mark that onto the piece with a fabric pen. So I've just finished getting all of my pieces cut out. So I've got 2 pieces for the front of my top and then 2 pieces for the back, and I've got that mark drawn on for where I'm going to attach the straps. Now the only other thing that you need to cut out are the straps themselves. So for the straps, you'll need 4 in total. I like to do mine at 3 centimeters wide and 42 centimeters long, but I cut mine on a fold, so this is 21 centimeters long. You can do them as long as you want, but I would recommend keeping them at 3 centimeters for the width. So you just need 4 of those, and for me, I've done those 3 centimeters wide and 42 centimeters long. So now that I've got all of my straps cut out, I'm just going to take them over to my machine, fold them in half, and sew them in place. I'm aiming to make a strap of about 1 centimeter wide, so you've got some seam allowance built in there. And you've got 2 options. You can either use a straight stitch and slightly stretch the fabric as you're sewing, or you can use a zigzag stitch. I'm going to use a straight stitch, so I'll show you that on my machine now. So I've got my machine set to my straight stitch. I'm just going to measure to find where 1 centimeter is, and it's just lined up with the edge of the foot here. So I know that if I line up the edge here, I'll be making a strap of about 1 centimeter. So I'm just going to start with a couple of stitches and a reverse stitch to secure the seam in place. And now I'm just going to gently stretch it. This is just going to make sure that as we're wearing it, the straight stitches don't break as these pieces stretch. Just always keeping that edge lined up to the edge of the foot here. And then just reversing at this end as well. And just trimming that off. And then I'm just going to trim off some of that excess as well. If you want to do this with a zigzag stitch, it's pretty much exactly the same. You just don't want to stretch it as you sew. So that's how the strap looks once I've trimmed the excess off. I'm just going to go in and repeat that for my other 3 straps as well. So once all of my straps are sewn in place, I'm just going to turn them to the right side out using my loop turner. So you just thread it through there, clip it onto the end, and then pull it through. If you have done your seam with a straight stitch, do this very gently, even if you've stretched it as you've sewn. In fact, even if you've done this with a zigzag stitch, do this nice and gently. And then the last thing I'm going to do, just zoom in a little bit, is to fold that end in on itself. And then you can either sew over the end of that with your sewing machine with a straight stitch, or I'm just going to sew it in place with a hand stitch. And then I'm going to repeat that for my other 3 straps. So once all those straps are finished, I'm going to put those to one side and I'm going to start working on the front of the top. So I've got both of my pieces here. I'm just going to use one for now. So I'm going to start by hemming this top edge of the front of the top. I'm going to use my fusible interfacing to do this, and I'm just going to place it under that fold and iron it in place. This is going to make sure that this edge is nice and flat. If you do it without interfacing it might be a little bit wavy, but you can definitely do that if you don't have any interfacing. It won't make too much of a difference. So I just have my pieces of interfacing here. I've just cut some slightly thinner strips. I'm going to place that under here and then go over the top with my iron. You want to try and aim for a hem here of about 6 millimeters. It doesn't matter if you do a little bit more than that either. So just pressing that in place. So once you've got that edge pressed in place, I definitely did that a lot bigger than 6 millimeters, so don't worry if you have as well. I'm just going to go in and sew that in place with a zigzag stitch just straight across here, and I'm going to repeat that for my other piece as well. So I've just sewn that edge in place and I've repeated for my second piece as well. Just zoom in slightly so that you can see. If you did fold more than 6 millimeters like I have, try to make sure that you sew this top stitch closer to the fold than this raw edge here. That will just make sure that you can hide it with one of your other seams. So now I'm just going to turn that over, and then I'm going to take my other piece, which I've done the same steps for, and I'm going to place that with right sides facing together with the first piece. Just line up those corresponding edges. Now I'm going to go in with some pins, and I'm going to pin around the armhole on both sides and along this bottom edge as well. Now I'm going to go in and sew those 3 edges in place with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch if you don't have an overlocker. So once those edges are sewn in place, you want to take your tape measure and just measure 1.5 centimeters away from the seam. You don't want to measure away from the edge of the top. You want to measure away from the seam, and then just mark that in place and do that on the other side. So 1.5 centimeters away from the inside edge of the seam rather than the edge of the fabric. And mark that on this side as well. Just zoomed in so you can see a little bit better. So that's just 1.5 centimeters away from the inner edge of the seam. And I'm going to sew between those 2 marks with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So I've just finished sewing that top edge in place. It should look something like this. So these ends are completely untouched and I'm just sewn in between them. I'm just going to turn this piece to the right side out. So this is how that should look when it's turned to the right side out. You should be able to put your finger through this section here. So now we're going to add the tunnels, which is where your straps are going to go through. And you want to sew this about 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the fabric. If you want to, you can measure this all the way up and draw it in with tailor's chalk. But I'm going to do the same trick on the sewing machine where I'm going to measure from the needle. And I'm going to use a zigzag stitch for this. I would recommend using a zigzag rather than a straight stitch because this curve is going to be a little bit more difficult to stretch like you did with the straps. So I'm just going to use a zigzag stitch and sew 1.5 centimeters away from this edge on both sides. I'll show you how I do that on my machine. So I've just started by setting my machine to the smallest size of my zigzag, and then I'm going to measure from the needle 1.5 centimeters out so that I know that I have to line up the edge of my fabric with this line here. So I'm just going to line that up to that edge here because I know that's 1.5 centimeters, and then I'm just going to follow all the way up to the top with that zigzag stitch. Just reversing to secure that stitch. And then again, just reversing at the end here. I'm just going to trim that off and I'm going to repeat it for the other side. So now that those tunnels are sewn in place, I'm just going to thread my straps through these sections. I like to use a loop turner to do this, but you can also just use a safety pin. And then I'm just going to tie a knot just at this end, just to stop it from moving around, just for the time being. I'm going to do the same with this side. So that's how it will look once your straps are added. I should also mention you want to make sure that the end of the strap that you finished off and like tucked into itself wants to be at the top here rather than at this side edge here. So now you can move on to make the back of the top. So I've got my two back pieces here. I'm just going to remove one for now. And I'm going to take my two remaining straps. So hopefully you can just about see the marks that I've got for the guide for my straps. I'm just going to place them on top of those marks. I like to leave just a little bit above that top edge just to make sure I get everything in my seam. And then I'm going to take my other back piece, and with the right sides facing together, I'm just going to place that on top and line up all of my corresponding edges. Just start to pin across that top edge. I'm going to include the straps when I'm pinning that in place. Just check in to make sure it still lines up with that guide. And then I'm just going to tuck these straps inside here, and then I'm also going to pin along this bottom edge. Once those edges are both pinned in place, I'm going to sew across the top edge and across the bottom edge with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. Just being really, really careful, especially along this top edge, to make sure that you get all of the layers, including this strap. So just across the top here and then across the bottom here. So once those seams are in place, then you can start to put this piece together with the front of the top. If you want to check your straps are sewn in properly, this would be a good time to do it. Mine look okay. You're going to keep this piece inside out, and then I'm going to grab the front of the top, which should be the right way out. So I've got the back of the top here and the front of the top here. Back of the top is inside out, front of the top is the right way out, and the front of the top I'm just going to fold in half, and I'm going to undo these knots as well, just leaving a tiny bit of that strap sticking out at the end. That's just going to make sure that you get that strap in the seam. We've just got a little bit poking out at each end. So I'm going to fold that in half, and then I'm going to place the front piece inside the back piece. I'm just going to match up those side seams and pin them in place. So now I'm just going to sew both of those side edges in place with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So I've just sewn the two side edges in place. Now you just need to turn this to the right side out. So I'm going to unpick a small hole around here on this bottom edge. So now I'm just going to use this hole to turn the top to the right side out. Once you've done that, just check your side seams to make sure you've not missed anything, because there are a few layers that you'll be sewing for each of those seams, so it can be quite easy to miss something, and it doesn't look like I have. So now the only thing left to do is to close up this hole at the back. I'm going to use a ladder stitch by hand. So for my ladder stitch, I've just got the hole, it's kind of folded itself in where the seam was before. I'm just going to go one side for one stitch, and then trying to keep that parallel, I'm going to go to the other side for another stitch. And then again, going parallel to the other side for one stitch, and again to that other side. I'm just going to do that all the way along the length of the hole, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to tie it off where I started. It's going to make sure you've got a nice strong seam here. So then once that hole is all sewn up, the top is finished. The only other thing that you might want to do is to add a top stitch. So you could add it across here just with a zigzag stitch and then around this bottom edge. But I personally prefer the way that it looks without. So I'm just going to leave it as it is.